The Ukrainian strikes are putting so much pressure on the Russian fuel system that rationing has actually started, at least in parts of Russia. This, while their offensive is kind of stalling for the moment, but we'll talk about this as well as about anything else that has happened along the front lines and behind them in this SITREP about the war in Ukraine. We'll start off with the developments along the front line, and in Sumy we do have a visual evidence of the Ukrainians having advanced. The Russians recently entered the town of Bezalivka. I showed it to you in one of the last SITREPs, and now we have the Ukrainians confirmed back in the town. The Russian mill blogger Riba has confirmed that the Ukrainians are back in control of Bezalivka. That was it from Sumy. I do not see any changes, and no changes in Kharkiv either. So we switch directly to the Eastern Front. Here we have the Russian mill blogger Slatkov writing about the situation in Kupiansk. He says that the Russians are getting closer and the outskirts are a gray zone, so contested, and this is more or less confirmed by the last geolocations we have it. I do not see that it would happen on the eastern side, and from the context I think he mostly writes about the western side, and here we not only have the deep state map already showing the first houses under Russian control, but we also had the recent geolocations of the Ukrainians operating in the north where Russians were. So we do know that the Russians are now clearly inside of Kupiansk, even though to which extent they have consolidated is unclear. The Ukrainians have advanced though. They have advanced at Novye Horivka. This is down here. Let me quickly check. We have the geolocation here, Novye Horivka, and this is here on the map. It is at this point. So we have the Ukrainians entering this forested area. We have the visual evidence of this with the geolocation of them operating in this. So a small Ukrainian advance, but that's not all. We also have the Ukrainians here in the town of Novomykhailivka, and they have recaptured the town. So they managed to push the Russians back down here, and we see the deep state map has adjusted itself according to this. Further south, the Russians have advanced though. We have Konstantin Mashovets, the Ukrainian analyst and former colonel, who writes that the Russians have now taken Torske, and this is definitely true, as we have a geolocation directly west of it again with the Russians inside, and we have the Russians not just here inside of Sarichne. We recently had them down here inside of Sarichne as well. All of that confirms that Toretske has now fallen to the Russians. That was it north of the Seversky Donetsk. South of it, I do not see significant changes in the direction of Siversk. In Kostiantynivka, we do have changes though. The Russians are now in the north of Shcherbinivka. We have the geolocation again of Russians operating here in the northern part. There are several geolocations recently in this area. Mashovets again talks about the situation here and says the Russians are in the northern part of Shcherbinivka. They have infiltrated, and the Ukrainians fail for a full week to clear the area. This implies more or less a permanent presence in that, but also that there are still Ukrainians in there in the direct surrounding there. Otherwise, he wouldn't talk about them failing to clear it. We also have the Russians in Katerinivka here, where they are waving their flag. We have it here inside of Katerinivka. Now again, flag waving in the center does not necessarily mean you've captured all of the town. Theoretically, out of line of sight, there could be Ukrainian soldiers still active, but it's a distinct possibility that Katerinivka now has fallen, and with the fall of Katerinivka, it's questionable what has happened to everything west of it, whether Ukrainians are still there, as a communication towards the west along the reservoir should be close to impossible. The Russians also have crossed over the main road and to the main road of supply. We have that here in the north. It's northwest of the mine. We have them at two positions here, one down here and one here. So the Russians have operated here and here, which indicates us that they are like 600-700 meters away from the reservoir, which also means that the cauldron down here is about to be cut off. To which degree the Ukrainians have already withdrawn, to which degree they try to hold this, to which degree they might lose personnel because they waited for too long is obviously unclear, but any indications seems to be more or less obvious that the resupply of the Ukrainians, at least on the ground in the area south of the reservoir, should be close to impossible as of now, at least without significant losses. In the Pokrovsk region, we have the Ukrainians operating and advancing. We have a recent geolocation from the south of Pokrovsk. Here, the Ukrainians were using a Leopard 2 tank to clear a building from the Russians. According to reports, that's mostly small infantry groups that infiltrate, and that's one of the reasons why we see so much more Ukrainian tanks recently than Russians. The Russians barely use their tank along the front lines anymore, as in the offensive they would have to cross huge swaths of open land and expose them to the Ukrainians, where for the Ukrainians they use them to clear out buildings. I've seen probably 5 to 7 videos in the last 2 weeks of Ukrainian tanks shooting at positions, but usually from distances of 20 meters or less. This is an indication and could be easily explained with those infiltration tactics. If Russians walk into Ukrainian controlled areas, they can only carry with them what they can carry, and if they carry too much, it makes them slow and thus easy target for drones. So they will try to travel light, and there it's simply more likely that they carry additional magazines of 545 for their assault rifle than heavy and cumbersome anti-tank weapons, and that allows the Ukrainians to close in with their tanks, as the Russians in many cases simply won't be able to respond. That, by the way, does not mean Ukrainian tanks are immune against drones. For instance, from Pokrovsk itself, I've also seen a video of a tank being hit there, a Ukrainian tank. So the Ukrainians use their tanks more aggressively than the Russians, but obviously they have to pay for it to a certain degree as well. Then we have Mashowetz, again talking about the situation here in the Dobropilya, here where the Russians advanced towards the north, and he's saying that the Russians were pushed away from the road here in the north. I mean, that's we had visual observation of the Russians in that area, but it was considered to be cleared. But again, confirmation by him. He says that Kucherev Yar is mostly cleared, but that means there should be still Russian soldiers in this region. And he says the Russians try to break through to the northern units, to their forces that are cut off in the north, but that was not successful. So confirmation that the Russians try to push towards the north here again, but that it fails. The Russians have also advanced a little bit inside of Udachne. We have them here in fresh positions north of the railroad. That should be more or less at this point here, where we have the Russians once again. Then we have something from the Crimea, a Ukrainian attack on the railway logistics that we see here. And I see that I slipped in one. Never mind, we go to this. Here the Ukrainians struck railroad logistics, as we can see here in the fire. We can clearly observe an more intense Ukrainian strikes against the railroad logistics in the past 3 months or something. So they have put a higher focus on prohibiting and making it more difficult for the Russians to resupply their forces. And we have an advance here in the Zaporizhzhia region. That was my mistake because it wasn't in the right position. We have a geolocation of Russians in the south of Stepanohirsk. This is here at these positions. Let's quickly recheck again. So this is that lake here, and we have them directly to the west of it at the tip. So a Russian position recently at this point at the outskirts of Stepanohirsk. And that's it with territorial changes. We see that the Russian advances are slow, but still they do make small advances, especially in the overall trends. Recently, the Ukrainians have been significantly more successful in counterattacks, but I do not think we can claim that this is an overall change in the dynamics, that the initiative is switching to the Ukrainians right now. We have local counterattacks. Recently, several of them have been successful in this region, but the Russians at the same time were successful further south of it. The situation here is mostly unchanged and not moving much in this area. The Russians are recently advancing a little bit inside of Udachne, and the Ukrainians managed to push the Russians back in the Dobropilia area. Here, Novoekonomichne, we saw Russian positions, Ukrainian positions east of the town. So Novoekonomichne is still not under Russian control, but the situation of the pocket south of the reservoir, close to Toretsk, is probably critical as of now, and we should expect a swift change of the front line, probably a collapse of the Ukrainian positions within the next couple of days. Further north of the Seversky Donetsk, obviously the loss of Toretsk is painful, and that the Russians are now inside of Kupiansk causes additional trouble. Overall, the situation is thus mostly unchanged. We'll switch to the political area, and here we have, according to the Financial Times, the US are saying they would provide strategic enablers for a peace mission inside of Ukraine. So mostly command and control and ISR, intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance. The European idea right now seems to be a demilitarized zone with neutral troops, so maybe Chinese or African or Asian. Behind that, the Ukrainians, which are trained and equipped by NATO. And behind the Ukrainians, the Europeans as a third line. So not directly at a potential front line. And further behind the Ukrainians, significantly further behind the Europeans, not Ukrainians. Significantly further back would be the Americans. But at the same time, the Russians are categorically declining NATO troops inside of Ukraine. And I say that since this was the first idea, Russia will only accept NATO forces if it's pressured to do so. Russia tries to keep Ukraine out of influence of NATO. They are waging a war. That's one of the reasons why they're waging a war for this. So to suddenly allow Ukraine to basically forward deploy. Right now, NATO officially is along this line here, that the Russians would suddenly agree to NATO forces being here is absurd. They will accept it if they are forced to it, if this is their only choice, but we are far from something like this. And then, of course, we have to admit, if European forces are significantly behind the Ukrainians, that allows the Europeans to withdraw in case of renewed engagement. And that could be something that the Russians are betting on, that the Russians would speculate that the Europeans don't have the stomach to fight them anyways. So whether or not this would have an effect, whether or not this would actually secure the peace is questionable in my mind, as the Europeans have to be willing to fight, and one way to ensure or make it more likely that they fight is by them suffering losses. But if they are 50, 100 kilometers behind the Ukrainians, then the Russians can simply avoid targeting them in the first days and thus see if the Europeans are withdrawing immediately. Then the US is finally apparently going to actually give additional pressure or put additional pressure on the Indians. 25% additional tariffs, now raising to 50. So Trump seems to be increasing it slowly to increase the pressure on India to stop buying Russian oil. India is currently buying 37% of its oil from Russia. Before the invasion, it was only 2%. So we see that India is to a significant part contributing to the Russian ability to finance the war. Russia also wants to export more oil, more crude oil. But the caveat is, while it will obviously mean increased income from selling crude oil, the reason for the additional export is that their refineries are damaged. And the real profits are not in selling crude oil, but they are in selling refined products, so diesel, gasoline, etc. And the Russians are no longer able to export, at least as of now, because of the Ukrainian strikes. And this has actually led to the Russians to start fuel rationing in first regions. So far from what I see, it's mostly limited to 95. So just to the more refined version, but it's still fuel rationing arriving in the third biggest oil producer and the third biggest country with the third biggest refinery capacity, thus showing the effect of the Ukrainian strike campaign. Then we have the Russian Cabinet of Ministers, who is proposing that Russia should leave the European Convention for the Prevention of Torture and Inhumane or Degrading Treatment or Punishment. Now, obviously, we could say the Russians don't follow it anyway, so it doesn't matter, as we have more than enough proof how Ukrainian prisoners of war are treated inside of Russia. But the excuse for the Russians is that this is redundant, as torture is already banned in the Russian criminal code, so why would they be part of that convention? In international support, we have Germany committing to 9 billion euros a year for the next 2 years for Ukraine. That's roughly $10 billion. Canada will pay $500 million will provide $500 million for the purchase of US weapons. And Canada has also signed a defense industry agreement with Ukraine for joint production and joint exchanges. So the Ukrainian production might also profit from this. But that was it for today's SITREP. If you like this, please give it a thumbs up. It helps with the algorithm. Leave a comment if you have something to add. If you're new here, I would like to invite you to subscribe to the channel and hit the bell icon. This channel is only possible because of the support of viewers like you. If you like to support the channel, you can do so by the means in the description. But that's it from me for now. Thank you for watching, and I'll be back.